that continue to fester among the Armenians. So for them, that the world should know about them and their history is very, very important. They consider this an enormously high price to pay for the world to take notice of them, however.
Professor Manuelian, is this a healthy, if you can speak of it that way, a healthy byproduct of the tragedy of the earthquake?
Well, let me make a comment about the segment of Armenian history that the press doesn't have the time or space to cover. I mean, I think that whenever the Armenians are mentioned, it's in terms of the tragedy, the genocide, and the earthquake. But nobody goes a little further back. You see, as Vartan Gregorian said, it's a history of over 3,000 years. And during that history, it's been an international tale. And the Armenians have played an international role in history. And when you talk about Armenia, you're speaking about the history of the Greeks and the Romans and the Byzantines and the Crusaders, and many important contributions to Western civilization. I could talk about the highly advanced building techniques. You saw some of the churches earlier, the brilliantly colored manuscripts. But in terms of learning, scholarship, of translating ancient texts, the texts of early Christians, the fathers of the church, into Armenian and thereby preserving them for posterity. The fact that they played a very important role during the Crusader period. For example, the Pope in the 14th century said at the council that no nation or people helped the Crusaders more than the Armenians. All of this is a very fascinating history and very important in terms of the history of the West. And it's hardly mentioned, and barely mentioned in the press at all. And I think that in order to have a fuller perspective on this people, you have to go a little bit further back, beyond the 19th century, back to the 6th century BC and forward.
Well, I don't dispute that for a moment, but Michael Arlen, isn't it the case that the Armenians, both Armenians in the diaspora, so to speak, and in Soviet Armenia, are themselves fixated on the genocidal acts of the turn of the century, and by a deep sense of lack of understanding of that in the world? Well, Professor Hovannisian mentioned a psychological link between that and the earthquake. Do you make that link?
Well, I think in the first place, when you have a population, a worldwide population, no more than roughly 5 million, let's say roughly 3 million or so in Soviet Armenia and 2 million roughly worldwide, I mean, let's say between 5 and 6 million, anything that happens to, for heaven's sake, 50,000 Armenians or 100,000 Armenians, I mean, it's an enormous matter. And you tend to feel akin to Armenians who, you know, one has never seen. As, you know. But having said that, I find in my experience is that my American friends tend to sentimentalize the earthquake more than my as it were, fellow Armenians, in the sense that my American friends call up and say, "Isn't it so awful?" Which, of course, it is. You know, once more, aren't you such an ill-fated people? And I agree with, I mean, you know, with what Lucy and Vartan was saying, that I mean, we live happily in a country today that can barely remember 20 years ago. We're talking of when you talk about Armenians, a people that goes back close to 3,000 years as a coherent people. And that's a long journey, and you sort of expect there will be, you know, mountains and valleys and, you know, rough and smooth and bad and good. And it's to be taken as part of the journey. It's the nobility is in the extent of the journey.
A part of the journey, but a part, as I've read some Armenians saying, a part of a particular fate, which hovers especially over Armenians, that even natural forces.
I mean, I think, I mean, that's all magic. No, I mean, I mean, the Armenians have been part of various ironies. I mean, the irony, for example, of, as it were, choosing in that particular part of the world, which is a central part of the world, to have become the first Christian nation. You might say buying a growth stock. Christianity must have looked awfully good back then. Buy it at the start, you know. It turned out, however, that Armenia became this sort of island of Christianity in what was an increasing sea and ocean of Islam.
Well, I think that, that 1915 is a very significant date. That is, all Armenians at various stages of acculturation, whether they're quarter Armenians or first-generation Armenian Americans or third-generation, the one thing that links them more than anything else is a negative, perhaps, image of death and destruction of their people in 1915. And this has been magnified by the fact that death and destruction has not been adequately recognized either by the perpetrator government or its successors or the world at large, even though in 1915 to 1920 the New York Times and every other major newspaper headlined the destruction of these people.
What has that done to the Armenian psyche, to have their Holocaust ignored, denied, forgotten, buried, whatever?
It's enormously traumatized them. It's prevented them, it's created an enormous barrier for them to get over to do more creative types of things. There's so much energy and effort that goes into trying to prove what needs not be proved, that a whole people was destroyed because they don't exist on that land anymore.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It makes them crazy.
Well, I mean, the fact that after the genocide of 1915-16, there were not only no war crime trials, there was, indeed has been, even as we speak, I mean, no admission of guilt, no admission on the part of the perpetrators that anything took place.
And on the contrary.
And this makes you crazy. I mean, in private life, it makes people crazy when they have something awful happens to them. They get attacked or whatever it is. Nobody will, admit it. And in, the life of nations, it makes you crazy.
I'd like to add a point there. I think Armenians are told they've hallucinated, that this thing did not happen. Greater insult you can hurl against any nation is that what has happened to them is subject to hallucination or fabrication.
Or an individual, a victim of a crime.
Or you caused it.
Caused it. Imagine if Jews were told now that the whole Holocaust was a hoax, and there are people who are doing it. Imagine if they're told that this not only did not happen, but Jews perpetrated Holocaust on peoples and empires far stronger than they live, without explaining how they could have armed themselves and so forth, so on. But there's more important point that I think Richard alluded to, but let me mention. There are three tragedies have happened to Armenians. One, they have massacred historically Tatars, Mongols, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, all kinds of empires. Forces have come. One was depopulation of Armenia, Armenians being forced out of Armenia, partially at least. That's from 11th century on, creation of diaspora. Second one is not the genocide alone, but losing historical habitat of Armenians as a result of World War I. The third one, which nobody alludes to or writes about, Armenians lost also everything they had built in the Russian Empire for over almost 60, 70 years as a result of Bolshevik Revolution. Then fourth, Armenian Republic, the last hope, a small republic, promised as a major reward at the end of World War I because Armenia was little ally of great allies, relying on the words of allied powers, England, France, Italy, United States, and suddenly a sense of betrayal. So it's not only tragedy, but a sense of betrayal. And what you were asking initially, Armenians being recognized now, it's recognition of not that Armenians have contributed a lot to civilization, not just Western civilization, but civilization in general, Ottoman Empire, Persian Empire, and all that, but also that no historical justice has been meted to them. That's the sense of frustration, in a sense.
So now, how does this tragedy, coming on top of all this psychic life that you've been describing, how does this play on top of that?
Well, the other thing is that, as Vartan mentioned, this sense of history, I would like to say that another aspect of the frustration of the Armenians in this country is that nobody knows, as I said, this longer stretch of history. And I feel that it's incorrect for the American nation to think of the Armenians as just being slaughtered through the centuries. I think they should also concentrate on the fact that they have survived and ask themselves why they survived. And the important thing is they had the ingenuity and creativity. Richard said that they need this acknowledgement in order to get beyond this block and to be more creative. I would say that it's an inspiring lesson for us as Americans to look at that history and realize they have survived because they've always worked and created despite what happened to them.
Okay, let me ask you something. Go back to the Soviet Union. We started talking about the earthquake. You've all been talking about the genocide, to a degree. Mr. Gorbachev went to Armenia from the United States to look at the destruction and was shocked personally and angered visibly because so many Armenians wanted to talk about the dispute with Azerbaijan, which was at least as strong in their minds as the fact that 55,000 of their countrymen were lying dead under the rubble around them, and he was shocked or astonished or politically annoyed. No,
but it's entirely logical.
Well, why is it logical?
Entirely logical because for them it's all one and the same thing. The fact that they have this enormous earthquake and tragedy, the fact that for the last 11 months Armenia has been going through a revolution without guns. It has been trying to open up the Soviet system. It's been trying to bring democracy. It's protesting against corruption. It's protesting against pollution of the land. All of these are the improvement of the individual and the improvement of the nation. They are looking for the advancement of the Armenian people. The earthquake struck them back. The fact that the Soviet leaders, in their view, have a way to at least bring home a little bit of territory that was artificially separated from them in 1923 in the Soviet era of Nagorno-Karabakh, which has, as you know, some 80% of the population is Armenian, and which is virtually contiguous with Soviet Armenia, and yet it was separated. For them, genocide, earthquake, and the union of this land to them, the democratization process is all very important. I think that the Western press is missing the point when they emphasize Muslim-Christian conflict, when they emphasize Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict as if it were a peripheral nationality issue for the Soviet Union, when there are much larger issues involved regarding the whole question of what is glasnost and what is perestroika. And I think that First Secretary Gorbachev was suddenly taken aback because he'd come back from the United States with his enormous popular image and press. He thought he was going back to be the leader in tragedy. And I think what I should also say is that most people were very much appreciative of the fact that he was there. But they did not like the fact that he, or the Soviet leadership at that time, also arrested a number of Armenians in Yerevan, the Soviet capital, who had been leading the demonstrations, the movement for openness, the movement for democracy, the movement for reconstruction, the movement for bringing back a little bit of the historic territory back to Armenia.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment, just and put it to you. The mass demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations that were mounted in Armenia last spring, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, amazing number.
Almost 1 million people.
Yeah, they had their effect in Moscow. The Armenian Soviet voted for the return of the enclave to Armenian rule. In Moscow, they listened. It went through their system. There was a vote on it, and the plea was rejected. Now, why is that? Why is that unsatisfactory?
Let me mention several things.
Yeah.
Number one, I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding on the part of Gorbachev and everybody else. Glasnost, everybody knows, it's openness. But perestroika means administrative economic restructuring. Armenians, Tatars from Volga region, all kinds of other nationalities, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and I can go on, all of them have seen in Gorbachev and perestroika a historical restitution of historical rights, not just merely to rehabilitate individuals, but to also rehabilitate historical injustices done. That's number one. I think Gorbachev was thinking that if he gave Armenia and other places, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, economic autonomy, that was sufficient for all the injustices that Stalin and his successors had perpetrated against nationalities. Second, there is no independent system of judiciary to resolve disputes among republics. The Republic of Armenia under Soviet constitution has a clause that they can secede from Soviet Union if they want. But the moment you want to exercise that right, you forfeit the exercise of that right, ironically. Second, in 1920, Rosa Luxemburg, 1918, advised Lenin not to create Soviet Union along nationality lines, but rather along economic zones. Nevertheless, Soviet Union created along nationality lines. But then they established some 22 zones, autonomous zones, postponing all kinds of subject or objects of conflict between republics for a future solution. Now we are, from 1920 on, some 70 years almost have passed, and none of those temporary solutions have proven to be adequate. And the issue Richard is mentioning is correct. They have not seen that Armenia is running out of population space. It's very small. They're finding also that if under the democracy and perestroika should be mutually inclusive rather than mutually exclusive. So I think Gorbachev is talking about economic restructuring. Armenians and other people are seeing in Gorbachev as great white hope. Hence the sense of betrayal and sense of frustration that Armenians demonstrated, 1 million of them carrying only Gorbachev's picture. There was not a single anti-Muslim, anti-Azeri, anti-Russian, anti-communist slogan. They all hope, and they still hope, that Gorbachev and Soviet Union, the time has come for them to mete out some historical justice which has been denied Armenians for such a long time.
There's still a great deal of respect and hope in Gorbachev. I don't think we should think that the Armenians have been entirely alienated from him. The intellectuals that I've talked to in Armenia the last few times I've been there, they are all just very hopeful, and they're writing things and they're saying things. They're reevaluating Armenian history in a way that could never have been spoken about before. They're bringing in pre-Soviet heroes, whether they're military, intellectual giants being brought back in, rehabilitated, and it's all happened in the last few years under Gorbachev, so that there is a great deal of hope linked with him, and the fact that the Armenians have come out into the streets to demonstrate is an evidence of that hope and that belief that the man meant what he said. And they're simply doing what they believe that Gorbachev himself was asking his people to do.
What do you, let me ask you each briefly, what do you think the future of the Armenian people is in the Soviet Union?
Well, what I hope it'll be is to take note of this long journey that they've been on, and that they've gotten this far, and to leave sort of you know, Ramboism to Rambo. I mean, in other words, I think that especially as the Soviet Union seems to be trying to reinvigorate itself or become more amenable to current economic trends, there's always a faction of Armenians who look at Mount Ararat and wish to recapture it, and one can hardly sort of deny the appeal of that. But I think if I wished my fellow countrymen well, I would wish them to just keep one day at a time, as it were. It's been a long journey. There've been lots of difficulties, but they have an awful lot of energy and intellect and so forth. And I think the responses that I mean, Armenians are so perversely stubborn. You try to condescend to them, as many people do, and they bite your hand. Then everyone says, oh, but I did just want to add one thing about the link between the earthquake and the genocide, which is media. I mean, that communications, that the Armenians thought their friends who were in Europe and America, the fellow Christians, were going to help them, and they didn't. And they kept looking in that direction, and nobody kind of...
You're talking about long ago.
Yes,
now, 2 generations ago.
Gorbachev, who I think is perhaps the great anchorman of our era, I mean, who, when he was standing on the tarmac at Kennedy, took a couple of sentences that, if you read them in print, are quite, I mean, ordinary, and made them, I mean, mediated the entire tragedy of the earthquake, so that people all over the world, certainly in America, suddenly said, ah, that must be something. This fellow thinks it's something. And that moment, the eyes swung, and that hasn't happened.
I think also for the outside of Soviet Armenia, which is very small, there are in the Soviet Union well over 1 million Armenians living outside of Soviet Armenia, nearly perhaps 1.5 million to 2 million Armenians. Many of them in rapid stages of assimilation because their churches and schools had been closed in the Stalin era. These Armenians are now going through a revival in Moscow, they've created a society for the first time, and they're teaching Armenian on Saturday school levels. They have an organization known as Husisapayl, which has a very historic significance to it, so that there is a ferment now in the Armenian world. Whether that ferment will rise and the yeast will rise and will be good bread, or whether it's going to go down, will depend on events that are to be coming.
Before the earthquake, and I was in Armenia in May and then last year, there was great excitement because of perestroika, because of the possibility of joint ventures with the West. And already in the last 10 or so years, there's always been Armenians all over the world trying to help Armenia, feeling close to it. But there was this, after Gorbachev, this great excitement that they could now help in a very tangible, concrete way.
And in fact, in the earthquake, the Soviet Union has admitted material American help for the first time since the Second World War.
Yes, but there are Armenian manufacturers and Armenian-American manufacturers in this country ready to work with Armenia. This was before the earthquake. I'm planning a film on those monuments that I don't have the heart to talk about right now, but which are the part of the legacy of mankind. And Armenia was very happy that they could make an agreement with me directly instead of going through Moscow. And I think that that spirit is certainly going to continue, and even more so. Unfortunately, the funds will have to go for rebuilding.
The future.
The future, Armenians are determined to rebuild their country, because we cannot afford the source to dry. The source is historical Armenia, and we have to replenish, maintain that source. And for over 2,700, 3,000 years, we have maintained the source. That's number one. Number two, Armenians believe that Soviet Union will be stronger if Gorbachev solves also nationality problem, because economic problem is not enough. Justice for nationalities is also a must in order to bring true brotherhood, and true union is based when everyone is equal and everyone can contribute equally to that union. And Armenians are not there to shy away from effort to rebuild their country, either abroad or in Soviet Union.
Vartan, I must leave it there, I'm afraid. Vartan Gregorian, Michael Arlen, and Dr. Hovannisian, and Professor Lucy Manuelian. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us.